Attention America! While the Trump administration announces record deportation numbers and calls it a victory for border security, something is happening that almost no major outlet is covering with the clarity it deserves. Over 4,000 Cuban nationals were deported, not to Cuba, but to Mexico. Left there without documents, without medical care, without money, without freedom of movement, and without anyone explaining what comes next. Stay with me because what I'm about to tell you is not just a story about immigration policy. It's a story about what those numbers actually mean when they land on the ground. Let's go straight to the facts. On May 27, 2026, Human Rights Watch published a 66-page report titled, "Casting Us Aside to Die." That title is not a rhetorical choice. It is the direct quote of one of the deported individuals when researchers asked how he was living his situation in Mexico. The report documents what happened to thousands of migrants between January 2025 and March 2026. In that period, the Trump administration deported nearly 13,000 non-Mexican nationals to Mexico. That is 70% of all third-country deportations carried out during that time. The largest single group, 4,353 Cuban nationals. The data comes from records the United States government itself produced, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, filed by the University of California, Los Angeles Center for Immigration Law and Policy. To understand why these people are in Mexico and not Cuba, you need to understand something the administration does not lead with in its press releases. Cuba has historically refused to accept the return of its nationals deported from the United States. That refusal is not new. What changed under Trump's second term is that instead of resolving that problem through diplomacy, the administration signed agreements with Mexico to use its territory as an alternative destination. Human Rights Watch describes those agreements as opaque, without a clear or public legal foundation, and without any mechanisms to regularize the status of the people who arrive. When a deported Cuban lands in Tapachula or Villahermosa, the two southern Mexican cities where the buses drop them off, there is no automatic right to work, no guaranteed access to medical care, no freedom to move through Mexican territory. As of April 2026, Mexican migration authorities were severely restricting movement, effectively trapping people in southern cities with no path forward. The profile of the people Human Rights Watch documented matters. The organization interviewed 41 deported Cubans. Most were 60 years old or older. Many had chronic illnesses requiring ongoing care. Several had lived in the United States for decades, primarily in Florida. 35 of the 41 lost their permanent residency after criminal convictions, in most cases for minor offenses. Driving under the influence, document falsification, minor drug-related charges. None of them were able to challenge their deportation to Mexico before being sent. No individual case review. No assessment of protection needs. A bus, a border, and a Mexican city. Before deportation, these individuals spent weeks or months inside immigration and customs enforcement detention facilities in the United States. What they experienced there is also documented. Severe overcrowding, extreme temperatures, inadequate food, limited medical access, verbal and physical abuse by detention staff. One facility mentioned repeatedly in the report is known as Alligator Alcatraz, located in the Florida Everglades, opened by the Trump administration to expand immigration detention capacity. One case defines the full picture. Geraldo Lunas Campos, a Cuban national, detained at an El Paso Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility. He died in custody in early January 2026. An autopsy classified his death as a homicide. The cause: asphyxia due to compression of the neck and torso during a physical restraint carried out by guards. That case was reported by The Guardian. There is another case that did not make the major networks but is documented in the report. A 67-year-old Cuban man deported to Mexico after living in the United States for decades. He arrived without documents, without money, without anyone waiting for him. He lived on the street. He died on the street. His death certificate listed his nationality as unknown. A man who spent most of his life on American soil ended up as an unknown in a country that was never his. Let's be direct about what the numbers actually represent. The Trump administration stands in front of cameras announcing record deportation figures as a policy achievement. From an enforcement standpoint, the numbers are real. But what those announcements leave out is that a significant portion of those deportations do not resolve the underlying problem they claim to address. Cubans are deported to Mexico because Cuba will not take them back. Mexico receives them without having asked for them, without a legal framework to support them, and without any assistance from Washington to do so. Those individuals end up in indefinite legal limbo in southern Mexico, which serves no one's long-term interest, except the administration's need to show high numbers before the midterm elections in November 2026. Human Rights Watch makes specific recommendations. To the United States, stop deportations to Mexico in the absence of clear protection guarantees, ensure individualized case review before removal, treat detention as the exception rather than the default. To Mexico, guarantee emergency access to housing and medical care, and create a legal pathway to durable status for those already there. Neither government has formally adopted any of those recommendations. Here is the question that this report puts on the table for anyone paying attention. If the administration's immigration enforcement framework is producing outcomes like the ones documented in this report, the policy conversation cannot stop at the number of people removed. It has to include what happens to those people after removal. 4,353 Cubans in Mexico, nearly 13,000 non-Mexican nationals in the same situation. A death certificate that could not name a nationality. Those are not abstractions. They are the documented results of decisions made in Washington. And the record of those results is now public, verifiable, and part of the conversation whether the administration chooses to engage with it or not. We will be following this story closely as the Mexico-United States-Canada Agreement Review approaches in July 2026, when migration and deportation agreements are expected to be part of the negotiating agenda. Stay with us. And before we go, we want to hear from you. Do you think the current deportation framework is producing the outcomes it was designed to produce? Leave your answer in the comments. If this analysis gave you clarity, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so every update reaches you first. There is one detail in this report that deserves more attention than it has received. Human Rights Watch requested authorization from Mexican authorities to visit the immigration detention centers in Tapachula and Villahermosa, where deportees are processed upon arrival. As of May 2026, that authorization had not been granted. That means no independent organization has been able to verify the conditions these individuals face inside Mexican facilities. That opacity matters for the United States side of the story, too. If the Trump administration's deportation agreements with Mexico are going to continue at this scale, the American public has a legitimate interest in knowing what conditions those agreements produce on the ground, not just the deportation numbers, the outcomes, the death certificates, the people living on streets and cities they never intended to reach. The administration has framed its immigration enforcement agenda as a matter of law, order, and national security. Those are legitimate policy priorities. The question this report raises is not whether enforcement is justified. The question is whether this particular enforcement framework, third country deportations without legal protections, without individual case review, without transparency on conditions, is actually achieving what it claims to achieve, or whether it is producing a different set of problems that will take years to account for. The record is public, the data is verifiable, and the 67-year-old man whose death certificate says nationality unknown is part of that record too. For too long, the immigration debate in this country has been framed as a choice between enforcement and open borders. What this report documents is something more specific and more uncomfortable than either of those framings. It is the gap between what enforcement policy says it does and what it actually produces when it lands in the real world. 13,000 people in Mexico did not land there because of a policy failure. They landed there because of a policy decision. Understanding the difference between those two things is where any honest conversation about immigration has to start. We will keep tracking this story, because the numbers that get announced at press conferences and the numbers that show up in Human Rights Watch reports are describing the same policy, and both sets of numbers belong in the same conversation.